How are you tonight?
Good.
Good. Well, thank you for being here and spending your Mardi Gras evening with us. We don't have any punchkis, but we do have some cookies and coffee, so help yourself. I'd like to honestly thank you for sharing your evening and spending your time here, whether you're a resident, whether you're an elected or appointed official, staff, consultants, agencies. Thank you very much for being here. And I also want to thank some agencies for helping Claire kind of form this meeting and go through how it would be covered and what would be covered and so forth. So we've had Grand Traverse County Health Department helping us, Eagle, Wade Trim, the Watershed Center, Conservation District, Area Landscape Company, and Lake Association board members. So we really appreciate that. Giffords Webster as well as here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Claire and she can kind of go through some of the highlights and some slides. So thanks again for being here.
Thanks, Beth. Okay, good evening. My name is Claire Carter. I'm the planner with East Bay Township. I think I've met many of you, but I see a few new faces. So thank you for attending this public workshop. This is focused on zoning protections in the township. So we're looking at kind of the land-water interface. This includes the Forest Lakes, Mitchell and Baker Creek, and tributaries, East Bay. We're looking at wetlands and floodplains, so kind of holistically looking at that interface between land and water. Just wanted to mention restrooms right out the hallway to the left. Please help yourself to coffee, water, cookies in the back. Also wanted to mention that this workshop is being live streamed on YouTube, so you can watch it on the Township's YouTube page, as well as it will be recorded to view at a future date. And if you signed in when you came in, we will follow up with a link with the presentation materials and link to the website or the YouTube link and materials. So as many of you are aware, East Bay Township is in the process of rewriting our zoning ordinance. It's based on the master plan that was adopted in January of this year. The zoning rewrite is a pretty big undertaking. It's the first time in many years that we've, taken a very holistic look at the whole zoning ordinance. So that effort is underway. And through the master planning process, the topic of protecting water quality was really a very high priority for residents and our focus groups and our survey, from township officials, from the planning commission, from the board of trustees. So it's really been elevated to a high priority, and thus the reason for this public workshop. So the results from this public workshop will feed into our zoning ordinance subcommittee that we've been working with our consultants, Giffords Webster, on. We're having bi-weekly meetings. And so we're looking to take the recommendations from this group tonight and feed it into our zoning ordinance update process. So I will mention that I know the zoning ordinance, it's long and it's complicated, but the provisions in our ordinance as they stand right now, we really do have very good protections for our water quality resources, but we're always looking to improve, and so this is an opportunity to take a look at, talk about what's working well and what are some opportunities for improvement, and how is our ordinance meeting the underlying goals of the township. And you'll see our goals are articulated in that master plan document that you picked up when you came in. So the purpose of tonight is really twofold. So the first half is going to be an education component, and we've got some great presenters with us tonight. And the education is really going to set the foundation for the public input opportunities, which will be the second half of later in the evening. So the education is going to focus on the importance of the riparian area, opportunities for protection, and then the current regulations at the county, state, federal, and township level, and an overview of those. So the second half of the meeting is the fun part, and so we really want to make sure that we stay on time because we have a lot to cover this evening. But the second half is going to be an opportunity for you all to work in breakout groups. There's a facilitator at each one of your tables to really take a deeper dive into some discussion questions. And then we'll come back as a group and report back our results. So you'll see there's a lot of handouts. There's a lot of information that you picked up when you came in here. So just to kind of give an overview, we had a zoning practice handout, and if you didn't get a copy of that, we'll send that out with resources when we follow up. But this is done by the American Planning Association. It goes into kind of the process for rewriting, an overview of the process for rewriting a zoning ordinance. This is an 11-page document. It's got information on the master plan related to natural resources, as well as kind of a summary and highlights from our zoning ordinance related to our natural resources and riparian regulations. We've got this little third piece of paper. If you have any questions for any of our presenters and we don't get to them, because we're only going to have time for a couple of questions, we will please fill these out, give them to the facilitator, and we will make sure that all of the questions get addressed when we follow up in an email. So if you put your email address down when you came in, we'll follow up with the answers to the questions. This is the handout that gives an overview of the breakout activity, and so hopefully all of you picked that up and your facilitator has a copy of that. And then this shoreline living was provided by one of the lake associations with some best practices and information. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters. We've got Heather Smith. She's the baykeeper with the Watershed Center, and she is our first presenter. After that, we have Faith Souza, with the environmental health coordinator with Grand Traverse County Health Department, and then we have Andy, is our senior planner with Giffords Webster, who's going to talk about the township zoning provisions. So you can just do it.
I don't do well like standing in one spot, but.
And also, this one will come out, so you can hold that.
All right, can everybody hear me? Okay, well, thanks for having me tonight. Big thanks to East Bay Township for inviting the Watershed Center to partake in this event. I want to briefly go through my agenda today. I am going to talk about the Watershed Center, Grand Traverse Bay. Then we'll talk a little bit about maps, watersheds. I'll show you some maps of our watersheds. Talk about the water resources in East Bay Township and why they are so unique. Talk about healthy watersheds and ecosystem services or community services that watersheds provide to us as humans. Talk about water quality threats, and then conclude with kind of options or considerations for local units of government. So first, the Watershed Center, Grand Traverse Bay, also just known as the Watershed Center, is a nonprofit organization that protects clean water in Grand Traverse Bay, and we do that in a number of ways. We protect the water that everybody loves, we restore waterways to Grand Traverse Bay, and we try to connect people to clean water. And one of the biggest roles that personally I do at the Watershed Center is work with communities, townships, municipalities, to look at zoning, master plan, land use policies, and try to adopt and enforce protective provisions to ensure that our water remains healthy in the area. So really quickly, I'm going to go through several maps so that folks have a good idea of where we're at. So this is a map of the Great Lakes Watershed, also known as the Great Lakes Basin or the Great Lakes Drainage Basin. So how many folks have a pretty good idea of what a watershed is? This feels like a pretty educated group of folks, but watersheds can be the term watershed can be tricky. And it is an area of land where all the precipitation that falls, it eventually is funneled into a lake or stream that ends up in one centralized place. So you can see here, all of this colored area, that's the Great Lakes watershed. Any precipitation that falls in that area is going to fall into one of our Great Lakes. Watersheds are nested, meaning that bigger watersheds fit into smaller watersheds fit in within bigger watersheds. So you can see here, all of the Great Lakes have their own watershed that makes up the greater Great Lakes watershed. This is an image of the Grand Traverse Bay watershed. So that covers about 1,000 square miles of land. All of that land, eventually, the water that drops in that land is ending up in Grand Traverse Bay. And you can see in the Grand Traverse Bay watershed, there's a number of sub-watersheds. The Elk River Chain of Lakes is our largest, kind of in this yellow area. And then we have the Boardman Ottawa sub-watershed. That's our second largest sub-watershed. Watersheds certainly don't follow political boundaries. So you can see here, this is an image of East Bay Township. It's kind of this square here. And there are several sub-watersheds in East Bay Township. We have the Mitchell Creek sub-watershed, the Acme Creek sub-watershed, which includes Acme Creek and its tributaries, as well as the East Shore watershed, that includes Baker Creek, and then, of course, the Boardman Ottawa. So now I'm going to transition in talking about the uniqueness of East Bay Township's water resources. We know that East Bay is a desirable spot to visit, to live, to work in, because it has such beautiful land and water resources. We have the sandy shores of Grand Traverse Bay. They give way to those forested hills and those lakes that are carved out by the glaciers. First, the east arm of Grand Traverse Bay, several miles of Grand Traverse Bay shoreline in East Bay Township. Most of it's fairly developed. There are some naturalized areas there, and you can see some of those images. I'm sure folks are familiar with this area. Next, we have the Mitchell and Baker Creek. Excuse me, folks. The Mitchell and Baker Creek areas. You can see Mitchell Creek is it's a pretty big creek system, number of tributaries that wind through the township, as well as Garfield Township, and then Baker Creek. Both of those outlet to Grand Traverse Bay. They're both cold water trout streams, and they're also under immense development pressure. As folks know, there's lots of development happening in kind of this northern portion of the township. Next, we have the Forest Lakes area. So I'm sure everybody's familiar with the Forest Lakes. There are 19 lakes in this area. You can see in the map in that southeastern portion of the township. Those are mostly seepage lakes, meaning that they are lakes that don't have an inlet or an outlet, but they are fed by precipitation and groundwater. They're relatively shallow lakes. They're very clean, clear, high water quality, good water quality, and you can see by these images and from the name itself, the forest lakes have really rich tree canopy. They're kind of that classic lake that you think of in that up north community, and also an area of immense development pressure. Next, we have the Boardman Ottawa River. That's in the more southern portion of the township. The Boardman Ottawa, I'm sure folks are familiar with this, but immense cultural, spiritual, recreational, ecological value in the Boardman Ottawa River. It is a Michigan Department of Natural Resources designated natural river, and with that state designation for natural river comes along some stringent development parameters or standards that were developed by the state but that are administered at the township level. It's also a blue ribbon trout stream that just shows you, that's a state designation as well because it has a superb fishery and it's accessible to anglers who are wading. I apologize for my font getting cut off here. You never know when you plug into another computer what your font's going to look like. We have the wetlands of East Bay Township, so rich in wetlands. Most of the wetlands in East Bay are kind of in those riverine areas, specifically in the Baker and Mitchell Creek area, and then along the Boardman. I'm now going to talk a little bit about healthy watersheds and ecosystem services or community services that watersheds provide. So healthy watersheds perform this concept of free work for a community that communities don't have to pay for or do themselves. These are called ecosystem services. That's a pretty popular term in scientific literature. You might also hear community services. And those are things that help us humans. Are things like air purification, flood control, recreation, scenic beauty, carbon sequestration. Healthy watersheds provide so many services to us as humans. And when we compromise healthy watersheds or compromise water quality, those ecosystem services are either reduced or eliminated. I just really briefly wanted to share an image of the connection between surface and groundwater, because oftentimes we think of them as two separate kind of bodies of water, but they are very much connected. So what we do on the land not only is going to impact our groundwater, because our activities on the land, when it rains, any sort of pollution that's on, or pollutant that's on the land can seep into the groundwater or the water table, and that is directly connected to surface water. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the natural shorelines and natural stream banks and the type of ecosystem or community services that they provide. So natural shorelines are shorelines that have plants and trees, soil, rock, woody debris. Those are shorelines and stream banks without much human disturbance, and they are so important for a healthy watershed. The complex root structure of the trees and the plants that we're finding in our riparian areas, or that land-water interface, they're very complex, they're very deep. For reference, turf grass has a root structure of about 2 to 3 inches. So you think about turf grass that we find in most of our lawns. Our native plants, things like willows, dogwood, some of our prairie plants, some of our riparian plants, those root structures are 3, 4, 5, 6 feet in depth. And those roots have play such an important role in helping keep our shorelines and our stream banks intact. They kind of bind that soil so they can deflect some of that wave energy and help with some of the stream energy or river energy. Plants also shade near shore waters, particularly important in streams, especially in the summer months where lots of sun and warm temperatures can warm up our streams very quickly. And with the absence of vegetation, we don't have that shading, and it's really critical for our fish species that have very narrow thermal tolerances. Natural shorelines and the plants that live there are really important for filtering water. So if we have some runoff, plants with really complex root structures do a really great job of breaking up the soil, so the water can kind of follow the pores in the soil and soak into the groundwater table. And of course, fish and wildlife habitat is really dependent on natural shorelines and on plants. The natural progression of the shoreline is that a tree will die, it'll fall into the near shore area or that shallow water, and it plays a critical role in providing habitat for fish species and invertebrates. So this is a slide borrowed by Eric Elgin of MSU Extension, and I think it really nicely demonstrates how diverse our land-water interface, our riparian zones are. And this slide, it's called the Transitional Zone. You can see that the diversity in that transitional zone is at its peak. It's one of the most diverse ecosystems that we have here in our state. Wetlands are another diversity hotspot, and the ecosystem services that wetlands provide are plentiful. They provide habitat, they're areas for migrating birds, they provide flood control, they help with erosion, especially as they're flanking streams and rivers. They're essentially the kidneys of our watersheds. They filter out pollutants before they get into our water. And of course, they're an area for groundwater recharge. Water kind of sits there and soaks into the groundwater table. They're very diverse habitats. They're also a habitat that's under immense pressure. I'll transition now into talking about water quality threats. So, the water quality threats in the Grand Traverse region are a little bit more diffuse than threats in other regions. And most of these threats have to do with land use or development practices, things like habitat destruction and wetland loss and disappearing vegetation. We all know that things are changing. Another slide that kind of funky came out in an interesting way. I apologize for that, but things are changing. We're seeing that along our lakes, we're seeing that along our streams, we're seeing that with our wetland loss. And this certainly has to do with this kind of immense development pressure that we're feeling in the Grand Traverse region. We know this unprecedented growth is changing kind of the character of where we live. The impacts from waterside development, another funny one, guys, sorry about that. They're immense. So when we think about kind of the cascade of things that can be impacted by waterside development, lots of different areas. We can have the removal of vegetation along a bluff or along a steep slope can lead to erosion or bluff failure. The removal of native deep-rooted vegetation along streams and lakes really compromises habitat complexity in that nearshore zone that I had referred to. Development can introduce invasive species or make it more likely for our invasive species to take over, things like the purple loosestrife that we have in this image. And of course, development along a water body, if you have an improperly functioning septic system or you're over-fertilizing your lawn, that could lead to nutrient-enriched waters, lots of phosphorus and nitrogen, which can cause algal blooms and other problems. And this image is another image kind of demonstrating some of the issues that we have with armoring or hardening the shoreline. So that's replacing natural shorelines with things like sheet piling or rock riprap, and then removal of vegetation. So you can see in the top there, oftentimes armoring or hardening comes with flank erosion. The unnatural shorelines, those hardened shorelines, don't do a really great job of absorbing wave energy, and they tend to deflect that energy to neighboring properties. So you can see that flank erosion. Oftentimes armoring, especially along the Great Lakes, it fails over time. These armoring structures can cost $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 or even more, and they're just not a permanent solution. They often fail over time. The removal of vegetation can lead to habitats that are simplified and have less complexity. That can also lead to things like erosion. I also wanted to mention that another threat that we're facing is the changing climate future that we're experiencing, with more intense rainfall, with less ice cover, with the Great Lakes swinging between the highs and the lows more quickly, and the highs are becoming higher and the lows are becoming lower. And so this is kind of making coastal flooding issues more intense. So we're seeing high flows in streams and high lake levels. Folks probably remember 2020, that almost near record high water levels, and it led to all sorts of water quality issues, as well as threatened lots of personal property. This slide is just to depict the type of threats or the level of threats that we're seeing from development. So that first graph that you see there, that's from the that's from the National Lake Assessment in Michigan, which assesses the states. This is like a rotating assessment done by the federal government in partnership with the state, and it's done every, I think, maybe 4 years. This image is from the 2012, and it really shows that water quality in Michigan inland lakes is fairly good, but over 50% of our inland lakes have poor lake habitat complexity, and that's really because we're removing a lot of the vegetation, and we're really interfering at that shoreline. This other image you see, this map, at the bottom right, that is depicting wetland loss. So this is just a kind of zoomed into the Baker and Mitchell Creek area, but you can see the yellow indicates the extent of current wetland, and that orange hatched area depicts the amount of wetland loss we've had from pre-settlement times. And across East Bay Township, we predict that about 37% of East Bay Township's wetlands have been drained or destroyed since pre-settlement times. So now that I gave you a little bit of an introduction to East Bay Township's water resources, and I talked a little bit about water quality threats and what that means for communities, I want to talk about local governments and things that we need to consider. So local governments have a plethora of tools to address land and water resources. There are things like education and hazard mitigation planning and the management of township properties, restoration, but I'm really going to focus on, for the next few slides, on zoning and land use practices. I'm also going to really focus on that riparian area in lakes and streams. Just to note, there's a whole set of best management practices for the Great Lakes. They're similar, but they're different, and we are working with the township on kind of Great Lakes coastal resiliency best practices, but for today's topic, we won't have time to go into that detail. So when we think about zoning, we think about several very useful tools. Riparian buffers. Those are strips of land that are adjacent to a waterway or a water body that oftentimes need to be vegetated, and that are really, the purpose is to protect the water resource. We also have setbacks. Those are distances that a building or structure or impervious surface must be set back from the water's edge. And then vegetation requirements that can live anywhere in the zoning ordinance. So one thing that communities need to consider is the buffer width or the setback distance. And you can see in the image, this is an image that helps communities deal with the width of a buffer. And in a perfect universe, if we wanted to protect for organic inputs, for water quality, for flood control, for habitat, we would have a 200-foot buffer along our waterways and our water bodies. But of course, we have to balance that with human needs and the desire to be close to water. So just determining what buffer width or what setback distance is desirable for a community is a big consideration. Buffers and setbacks, particularly buffers, are only as effective as how many encroachments you allow in that buffer. So for instance, a 10-foot buffer that can only be vegetated may be more protective than a 20-foot buffer that allows for some vegetation but also parking lots. So just deciding what type of allowed uses and structures are in buffers and setbacks is an important consideration. Also important to think about active planting requirements. And what I mean by this is if you were to buy a property along a lake and it is all artificial sandy beach, is there an active planting requirement to ensure that you are meeting those buffer standards? Or can you continue to have an artificial sandy beach? So active planting is a really important consideration for communities if they want to ensure that they have a really protective buffer. Requirements to preserve vegetation is something else to consider. Some communities decide to protect trees over a certain size, or perhaps some communities decide to protect the first 10 feet. No vegetation can be removed within the first 10 feet of a water body or waterway. And then landscaping requirement is also something to think about. Most communities in northern Michigan, I would say, have a desire to only allow for native plants to be planted for their landscape requirements, so something else to consider. And then finally, defining the applicability of setbacks, buffers, and vegetation requirements is really important. What districts within the township do they apply to? Do they apply to all water bodies, only some water bodies? And then what triggers compliance? When would you need to comply with these buffers? Is it a land use permit or something else? Wow. I also see this font is very light, so I apologize there again. Another important consideration for communities, and we're seeing this across the Grand Traverse Bay Watershed, is wetland protection. So folks may or may not know, and I think Faith is going to go over this in a little bit, the state regulates wetland dredging and filling. In most cases, that was delegated to the state by the federal government, the EPA. It's part of Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. Our state has authority over wetland fill and dredging. And that doesn't mean it stops wetland fill or dredging. That just means you have to apply for a permit to the state so that you can dredge and fill a wetland. So many communities across our region have decided that wetlands are really important parts of their healthy watersheds. They value wetlands, so they decided to fill in the gaps or make another level of regulation at the township to ensure their wetlands are protected. And they do that in several different ways. One of the tools that communities use are wetland setbacks for structures and impervious surface. That means, you might have to be, your parking lot might have to be 25 feet from a wetland. That dissuades developing a property that has a lot of wetland on it, and it also prevents encroachment to the wetland. There are communities that use wetland standards in site plan review, and those are different standards that can be applied to, approving a land use permit, ensuring that the wetlands are protected. And then finally, several communities across the state of Michigan have their own standalone wetland ordinance, and those complement, or work with state regulations. Those are often used to regulate small or isolated wetlands that are not otherwise regulated by the state. And so in summary, when we think about zoning and which provisions might be most appropriate for our communities, it's all about balancing ecosystem needs and human needs. And so what might work for a rural community may not work for an urban community, and a community it might be different. I often suggest that communities be really careful about conflicting zoning provisions, so ensuring that that there are no conflicts with different sections of zoning. We encourage our communities to understand and kind of accept nonconformities. There's often a desire to not want to regulate with this worry that there'll be a lot of nonconformities, but understanding that nonconformities can exist, and if you want to expand a nonconformity, there's oftentimes a pathway to do so, if appropriate. We encourage communities to avoid creating ordinance for exceptions. We see this oftentimes. Well, what about that one boat launch, or what about, and really understanding that these exceptions can be routed to the variance, and if it is a warranted exception, it should be able to attain a dimensional variance. We're really encouraging communities to plan for more community resilience due to our uncertain climate future. And I talked a little bit about that. We're seeing more intense storms. Things are certainly changing, more fluctuations in our water table and our lake levels. So really ensuring that what we're adopting and considering today is something that is going to pull us through and make us resilient in the future. And then, of course, every ordinance is only as good as what can be enforced, right? So working with communities to ensure that whatever is on the books is something that they feel that they can enforce and they have the appetite to enforce. And apologies again for that font, but here are a number of different resources for communities, residents, landowners that want to learn a little bit more about water quality and some of the different resources that we use at the Watershed Center. And of course, I have many more if folks have a particular topic that they want to learn more about. So that's it. Thank you. Do we have time for questions, or are we moving on to Faith? Okay. Anybody?
I'll give you one.
Okay.
I know you work all across the region, not just like here, but I know you're in northern Michigan, more so than just Grand Traverse County. Can you think of other areas or examples, or maybe it's just best practices, where communities have come up with creative ways to incentivize folks to enact a lot of this type of best practices? Like, is there a financial way, a social way, a communal way to get people to take advantage and implement a lot of these best practices?
Yeah. Yes, I think I understand your question. There are certain communities that might say, if you retain a certain amount of mature trees, maybe you can have 5% more impervious surface coverage on your lot in a particular district. So there are those type of kind of incentives, like you can get something else. Maybe you have increased density if you manage all your stormwater on site. So there are communities that use kind of that strategy. It can become a little bit complicated, but that's certainly one route. Sometimes site plan review standards can be kind of like more of a negotiating conversation with the developer and the planning commission, depending on how those are written. I don't know if that helps answer your question.
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of a good segue into where I was kind of thinking was, a lot of it is, I've heard a lot about it. I've seen some people take advantage of it just out of their own goodwill, or they want to do the right thing. I just wonder if there's, more creativity, and it's something we can maybe brainstorm on, is how do we get more people, the average person, to kind of step up and implement some of these things without it being like black and white forced down their throat type of a thing?
Yeah,
Is
yeah, I mean,
that way that-
for instance, if someone is, let me think, you know, the Watershed Center isn't leading this, but Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council, they have some sort of like cost share program where if someone has erosion on their site, they will help fund a native bioengineered soft shoreline instead of like the rock riprap. So there's some sort of like, you know, cost sharing where they help you find, you know, state and federal funds to, you know, the homeowner has to chip in as well, but there are certainly things like that that exist. I don't know if that helps answer your question. Yes, Ralph?
Yeah, Heather, you mentioned that the lakes and the forest lakes there are seepage lakes, and thus they're expressions of the groundwater, and certainly the headwaters of the Boardman River. Can you speak about groundwater protection within local ordinances and the need for that to protect our water resources?
Yeah, certainly. There are different tools for local units of government to protect groundwater. I think there's like groundwater protection programs. I feel like that's just where some of our communities are getting to, like wellhead protection programs and that type of thing. So I think there's certainly been more movement towards that and a deeper understanding of the connection between ground and surface waters.
Clearly, from the standpoint of drinking water, it's there, but the standpoint of the resource, I don't think we have that. I don't think we have a lot of movement toward that. A good example is brine and salt. We use a lot of salt, and it gets deposited in the soils and it's a reservoir, and it gets moved through the groundwater into our surface water resources.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. That's one of the things I think that we're just starting to understand. So folks probably are familiar with Kids Creek. That's a tributary to the Boardman that runs through urban downtown Traverse City in Garfield Township. And salt, so like chlorides, are potentially, we're thinking that it's impacting the aquatic community, and there's a thought, we're now doing some groundwater monitoring, that it's not coming from just runoff, but that our groundwater actually potentially has elevated levels of total chlorides. The Watershed Center is also piloting a road salt monitoring volunteer project where we have folks taking total chloride samples across the watershed. So that is a very good, very important consideration, because those are certainly very connected. I'm not sure I have enough time for any more.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Heather. And I would encourage you, she covered a lot of information. I would encourage you, if you have any additional questions, please write them down, and we'll make sure that all your questions get addressed. Give them to your facilitator at your table if they've identified themselves yet. If not, they will shortly. And so please submit your questions. Up next, we have Faith, and then we have Andy. And so fortunately, we're not going to have time for any more questions, but again, we will make sure to address all your questions in a follow-up email.
Hi there, I'm Faith Souza. I work for Grand Traverse County Environmental Health Department. I am the sanitarian for East Bay Township, and I recognize a few of you around here. So I'm just here to talk about quick and dirty, really. There's my little slide with my name on it. About the local, I guess not really local, but county and state policies for environment, mainly environment. So I wanted to go over this real quick, though. The ordinary high water mark, because it pertains to some of the stuff I'll be talking about. This is the slide from Josh, who is the land and water interface for Eagle for our area. So some of you may have met Josh Crane, but the line between the upland and the bottomland, and you can see the red line on that, which shows what Eagle calls the ordinary high water mark. Army Corps has maybe a slightly different definition depending and that's obviously on the bay, mainly, on the Great Lakes. But this is what we go with, is what Eagle says on the inland lakes, such as the forest lakes that we're talking about today. You can read what it says, but what I wanted to point out on here is on the red line towards the water side, that is Eagle. They cover that. Up above that, that would be soil erosion, which is what the health department and I do, is we cover that. So if you wanted to put riprap on your shoreline, Eagle would give you a permit for that, but the access road to that site that is disturbed or takes those trees out and bulldozes to get down to that, that's where I would come in. So that's just what I wanted to cover right there. Now, this one is a slide that Heather was nice enough to provide that I want to start though on this end. This is basically the federal government, that would be Army Corps again, covers woody debris and plants in the water along with the state. So if you want to rip out your cattails or rake up some of the plants in the water, which some people like to do, the state doesn't really like you to do that. So you would have to ask them for some permission. Same thing with shoreline modifications. That's the state, we just talked about that, and the federal government on the Great Lakes. Then the next one over is riparian vegetation, which is what Heather was talking about with the buffer zones and all that. So that's Township. Township is interested in making sure that the buffer zone stays intact, hopefully. Personally, I think it looks better too. But the next one over, wetlands. Township, Heather was also speaking about this. The township may be looking into increasing that. Really, the state watches over the wetlands, but you can build a structure right up to the edge of it. They'll delineate it up to that, but you can build right to that in East Bay Township. Some townships do not allow that. They have a 50-foot or more setback. We, for drain fields, honestly, it's not in our code. You can build them according to our code right up to the wetland. However, we do not do that. We go 50 feet away. Technically, if someone pushed back, we wouldn't be able to do that, but that's what we try to do. Next one, soil erosion and sedimentation. That's health department as well. And the state Eagle program, that would be Josh. They look over our shoulder and make sure that we're following through with everything. The stormwater permitting, that gets confused a lot with sedimentation control and soil erosion. Stormwater is only my jurisdiction if there's sediment in it. If someone's stormwater comes off their property and it hauls sand with it and goes on to someone else's, then I can do something. If it doesn't, if it's just water, I have no teeth. I can't do anything about it, but the township can. So, and the last one, septic systems and wells. Obviously, that's the health department. We permit those, and I'll talk about a little about that next here. So, some people don't know what septic systems look like. This is a traditional system. This is what you would see on a larger lot, not necessarily on a lot of these lake frontages. I mean, some of you probably have a dry well that was there since the 50s. But this is what you would see if you were to put a system in right now on next door here, if it wasn't on municipal. But, so you have the sewer line from the house going to the septic tank. From the septic tank, it goes out into perforated pipes laid out in a parallel to each other. And what that point of the septic system is, it's not just to get rid of the water. Dry wells do that. Dry wells do not protect the groundwater. Dry wells just get rid of the effluent. Drain fields are supposed to, if they're functioning like they're supposed to properly, they are supposed to treat it. Another term for that would be on-site wastewater treatment system. That's another term that the state likes to use now and that we try to use more. So you see it filters through and it goes down into the soil, and the soil is part of the purification process. There's bacteria in it, there's minerals in it, and it helps to remove the harmful things such as bacteria, phosphorus, nitrates. That being said, unfortunately, in the forest lakes in a lot of Michigan, a lot of the systems on those little tiny lots are really small. They're undersized, they're inappropriate, and they do not treat the nutrients that come through your effluent, or the medications, which people, you can't help much about that. But all right, so when we size the septic system, we're looking for the number of bedrooms, soil type, and if you have a garbage disposal or not. Really, the garbage disposal only has to do with the septic tank size, but it is there. So if you were to remodel your house and you had to get a construction code permit, we would have you fill out a well and septic status form. Actually, construction code would have you fill that out so that we could know to make sure that your septic system is sized appropriately for your addition. So I'm just going to go really quick through the setbacks because I was told that people were interested in why we do what we do. You have to have a setback from 50 to 75 feet from your well. And it depends on the type of the well, and we'll go over that later. But the distance, I think that's obvious why we want it far away from a well. I don't have to explain that. The building, because we do not want, it says 5 to 10 feet. 5 feet is for the tank, 10 feet is for the drain field, and that's because you do not want to have any effluent creeping into your crawl space or into your basement. So, yuck. And the 10 feet from the lot lines, I think that's kind of obvious. You just don't want to encroach on someone else's property. And from banks. So if you have a bank, you don't want, same thing. We don't want effluent seeping out of that. Nasty. And depending on where you are, 50 to 100 feet from surface water. 50 is typical. Some site condos now are 100 feet, but most it's 50. Then the most important one is the depth to high water table. In Grand Traverse County, it's 4 feet. It is not like that through the whole state. We do not have a statewide code, and there's a big reason because the state is so different in the soils. We in East Bay Township are mainly blessed with sandy soils, which is great for getting rid of the effluent. Not so fantastic for treating it, but it's better than having super thick clay, in my opinion. But so you have to have 4 feet, but as it says here, if you have an engineered system, you can sometimes get away with we'll let you get away with a reduced separation because it pre-treats the effluent. So when it's going into the soil, it's not nearly as high of nutrients. Sometimes when you have high water table, or you have a restrictive layer, or you have no space, you only have holding tanks. So those are like the worst, but they also keep the water safe because unless someone pokes a hole in them, which people don't do that, right? Okay, I put that picture of a well there because some people don't even know that's actually their well. Hopefully you all do, but I've had people tell me, well, what is that? The white pipe sticking out of the ground? Oh, that's my well? Yes, that's your well. So it's there for you. So there's 2 different types of residential wells, primarily. There's the private well, just your normal private well, and then there's a type 3 shared well, which comes into play when you have maybe like a dwelling and then an accessory dwelling that actually has bedrooms in it. Can be a garage even that's separate from the house. If it's attached, whole different story. If they're 2 separate, all of a sudden it's a type 3 and you have 75-foot setback instead of 50. You have different sampling when you put the well in, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, wells have to be set back from fuel oil tanks, other contamination sources. You have to be 3 feet away from your building structure because you want to be able to have a drill rig that can actually access the well if something happens to it. So you have to be 3 feet away. And then the big one, you'd be surprised how many oil and gas well sites are in East Bay Township, actually within the lakes. Some of you may be aware of that, but there's a bunch. And so that's something whenever I put a well in, I have to really pay attention to where those are. So, and then, may not think about that, but you don't want to put your well right where you push your snow, because you knock it over and then it gets broken and you have to replace it. And the minimum in the state is 25 feet deep, although sometimes site condos, depending on the hydrology of the soil and all that, we require deeper wells. So if there's like a nitrate issue or there may be a groundwater mounding issue, then we will change the depth requirements. But, so there's that. And finally, soil erosion and sedimentation control. So, quickly, permits, if you are doing any of these things within this county, because it's different, that Grand Traverse County is a little bit beyond what the state requires. If you are within 500 feet of surface water and you're disturbing the ground, pulling stumps, putting in a driveway, there's things that people don't think about, you know? But if you're going to disturb the ground, then you should probably give us a call at least. If you are disturbing more than 1 acre or more of land, if you're within 500 feet of regulated wetlands, that's a county thing. If you are working on slopes of 20% or greater, or within 500 feet of a county drain. And finally, if your site has Class D hydrologic soils, which we don't have a ton in East Bay, it's more like muck. If you're in muck, that would be primarily what that is. If you want to apply for a permit, and this pertains to well and septic as well. We have this new thing, and East Bay Township uses it too, Epic GT. It's not working so great for us just yet, but if you can't figure it out, you can always just call and give you a paper copy to fill out, because it's really kind of in the works still, but we're trying. But if you do that, and even if you come in, you still have to have a designated agent letter. If you are not the owner and you're applying, you have to have a detailed site plan, and you have to have an address. So sometimes there's no addresses yet. So you have to go, if you don't have an address, you have to go to equalization and have them get you an address. So those are the things. They're good for 18 months. They are, there's waivers and exemptions depending on how much space you're disturbing, and there's all kinds of things. And if you want, like I said earlier, if you want to build something, you go to construction code, they're gonna make you come to our department and at least fill out a site determination form. And if you need one, then you'll have to get your permit. But that site determination form, I think the township might require it. Some townships require it as well. I can't remember if East Bay does or not. But the construction code does, and you'll have to have that in order to, strangely, even if there's an exemption and it's in the ordinance that you don't need one, they still want the darn thing. So anyway, one of my pet peeves, but anyway. There is a brochure that I had, you could have picked up when you were coming in, that we just produced for soil erosion, just to answer a bunch of questions. And if you have some, the backside of it has frequently asked questions, so that might answer any that you have before you write them down. I probably should have said that earlier, but anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. I could have talked for a lot longer, but lucky for you, I'm not. So, thanks a lot, Claire.
Yeah.
The presentation.
You can just keep going.
Okay. Alrighty. Good evening, everybody. I'm Andy. I am with Giffords Webster. We're the planning consultants involved in the zoning ordinance rewrite. I may have seen some of you on the Zoom screen. We're meeting every 2 weeks with the township for the subcommittee meetings. So nice to see you tonight. Let's see here. Okay. So here's the zoning map. The major areas we're talking about tonight are the lakes area in white there, the Boardman River District in blue there, and the natural area in green there, and then as well as the Mitchell and Baker Creek overlay, which is kind of highlighted in, I believe that's a purplish blue outlined up here, and then the Forest Lakes overlay, which actually isn't delineated on the map, but rather set back from the Forest Lakes. So just to discuss some of the broad, zoomed-out lakes area attributes in the zoning ordinance. So the lakes area is mostly low-intensity residential uses, but then there's also some recreational uses associated with the lakes permitted as well. This allows also some kind of more intense special land uses that involve campgrounds, cabin courts, boat and motor sales and repair, mini warehouse, self-storage, neighborhood local business. The district is fairly permissive in terms of accessory structures and uses as well. In some instances, the building can exceed the size of the house. There's various shore structures that are allowed, and there's vehicle or recreational outdoor vehicle storage. Going on to the Boardman River zoning district. So this is actually pretty similar to the Lakes Area District in terms of, well, actually, some of the permitted and accessories are the same as the Lakes Area District. Again, the Lakes Area District involves a little bit more intensity. The biggest difference is that Boardman River permits forestry and wildlife management and purchase of development rights. Boardman River does not allow for as many special land uses as the Lakes Area District. That's kind of the biggest difference. Minimum lot size and lot width is, there's a larger requirement for such when you're within a certain distance from the Boardman River District, or the Boardman River, and then the Natural Area Zoning District. So the biggest difference here is that the Natural Area District requires a very large minimum lot size and minimum lot width. That's a 5-acre minimum lot size and I believe a 250-foot minimum lot width. So here's a comparison chart of kind of what's allowed in some of these environmentally sensitive zoning districts. As you can see, the Lakes Area District permits kind of the most wide-ranging land uses and really the most intense land uses. Kind of an issue, I think, with the PowerPoint, there should be a line there. So camps and campgrounds are allowed in both Lakes Area and Natural Area, whereas, like I said, forestry and wildlife management and purchase of development rights is allowed in Natural Area and Boardman River District. In all districts, detached single families allowed, accessory buildings, outdoor storage of RVs, and temporary docks. Moving on to kind of the dimensional standards of each of these three districts. As you can see, the biggest jump is going from Lakes Area and Boardman River District, which allows a minimum lot size of 40,000 square feet, which is pretty close to 1 acre. Natural Area jumps to a minimum lot size of 5 acres. Other than that, there's a lot of similarities in terms of like lot coverage, rear setbacks, dwelling size, height, as you can see here. So now moving on to the overlays. So broadly, with the Forest Lakes overlay, and first, before getting into the Forest Lakes, an overlay is commonly, they're pretty much just an additional set of regulations that perhaps a geographic area needs to abide by. A lot of them end up being kind of dimensional, really easy, tangible standards, such as like a setback or a vegetative buffer strip. So that's really what an overlay is they're just an additional set of standards for a geographic area. One of the most significant recommendations in the master plan was that some of these overlay standards be reviewed and perhaps strengthened if, the township believes, they need to be strengthened. The The current overlay for Forest Lakes is just, it's not drawn on the zoning map, but it's a 500-foot distance from the ordinary high water mark of the Forest Lakes. And that's I believe most of the Forest Lakes are covered. I believe there's maybe one or two that are not actually named in that ordinance. There's a thorough list of residential development standards in the Forest Lakes overlay. Some of the thorough regulations involve regulating the slope activity and construction, allows for very minimal construction on these slopes, and it requires natural vegetation be retained, regulates tree removal, also caps an impervious surface coverage at no greater than 20% of the site. I want to point to the handout that you received today, because it covers pretty much the thorough list of regulations that the Forest Lakes overlay pertains to. It looks like the handout I see everybody, it's got the green heading at the start. Yep. So that's the proper handout to look in if you want to see the kind of the full list of development standards. Moving on quickly to the Mitchell and Baker Creek environmental overlay. So this is drawn on the zoning map with a physical boundary. One of the biggest, most important standards here is that it prohibits structures or buildings within 100 feet of the Mitchell Creek or Baker Creek tributary. It also stipulates what the managed buffer strip looks like. It requires a tiering system where there's really 3 separate tiers of vegetation and trees and such that are required within the 100-foot mark there. In this area, everything besides a single-family residence is required to be a planned unit development. So that means there's really got to be demonstrated public benefits and high quality in those developments, so that the Mitchell and Baker Creek tributaries are not harmed by the development. Moving on to the general geography of these districts and overlays, I kind of summarized it in the previous slides, but all 3 of these environmentally sensitive zoning districts fit outside the future land use map's recommended growth boundary. The zoning plan in the master plan discusses the need to enhance some of the environmental protections, such as exploring further wetland protection provisions and reviewing the natural feature setback requirements. One of those considerations was that maybe this warrants further analysis of the Mitchell and Baker Creek overlay boundary, because the boundary doesn't really cover the full extent of those creeks. Also, the township might consider expanding the Forest Lakes overlay to cover more of its inland lakes. I believe there's a few that are not mentioned in that Forest Lakes overlay. So moving on to the zoning, kind of summarizing zoning versus general law, because there is a difference between the two. And when I say general law, that's kind of like police power ordinances, such as like an animals ordinance or a fishing ordinance or a boating ordinance. But zoning regulates how the land is used and kind of the dimensional attributes associated to how the land is used, such as setbacks, heights, sizes of structures. Zoning also allows grandfathering of uses, aka non-conforming uses. So there's a big difference there, whereas police power ordinance or general law ordinances usually do not allow for grandfathering. So really, those are some examples of general law. Streets and sidewalks are a common one. Licensing for businesses, boating, fishing, noise, junk, those are common general law ordinances. And I want to say the previous speakers kind of covered zoning, kind of gave a good preliminary look at what zoning is in terms of, vegetative buffer strips. And then Faith also kind of analyzed how different jurisdictions can be in charge of different areas. So enforcement, kind of on that theme, is that enforcement action is not always done through the township. The township is not responsible for everything, but they are responsible for zoning. So zoning enforcement is the township's responsibility, and sometimes other police power ordinances can also be enforced by the township, but sometimes different jurisdictions, such as the county or Eagle, have responsibility for certain areas. Really, one of the easiest ways the township can enforce in zoning is through site plans. Dimensional items, that are located on a site plan that has been turned in and has been part of a permit, per se. The township making sure that what's there existing is lining up with the site plan that's been approved is really the easiest way the township can enforce on something. So if there's a use that did not require a site plan, that's when there are sometimes, disconnects can happen because, for example, and I'm not speaking in terms of East Bay itself, but in terms of municipalities all over the state, a lot of times single-family residences require a lot lower of a threshold for details on a site plan. So a lot of times it gets tough when, let's say, someone removes a tree, and you don't know that tree existed in the past because it wasn't recognized on a thorough site plan. Or let's say, the backyard needed at least 50% of landscaping. That's something that on a commercial site is easy to identify because a site plan was probably required that needed to point out all these thorough dimensional requirements. But dealing with single-family homes, sometimes that gets difficult because sometimes the threshold for such review is a little bit lower. And I can't speak to the township itself. I believe the township is working towards a really detailed list on their permits for the Forest Lakes overlay. But it is, zoning kind of has to balance, private property rights, not over-regulating, while at the same time making sure that some very important considerations such as natural features and the environment are indeed taken care of. So that was kind of my zoomed out quick version of the presentation. I'm happy to, I guess we don't really have time for questions. I'm happy to answer one question. So Claire, you pick who's asking the question. Yep, sir. I see two from one table, so, okay.
Seems like most of the discussion so far is about wetlands and shorelines, and what about the rest of zoning? Is that on the table, like just urbanization, agricultural versus condominiums versus small homes? Because if you're just gonna allow urbanization to continue on any undeveloped parcels, it's gonna have all kinds of impacts indirectly, especially on habitat. Like, we're not talking about uplands, but animals need upland habitat to have corridors to move back and forth to the shoreline, and is any of that on the table?
So you definitely have some good concerns. I think that you might be a little bit more interested in maybe attending some of the subcommittee meetings, because I think the purpose of today was really water mostly, but definitely tree removal and habitat removal in site development in general is definitely a good consideration. We're doing the steering committee meetings. I don't know if you've attended any, but they're once every 2 weeks on Wednesday mornings at 8:30 a.m. So we are getting into some of the site standards for like what a site plan for a commercial development would need to adhere to. We should actually be discussing those maybe within the next meeting or the meeting after. So I think tonight's purpose was mostly water considerations. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure why tonight is on water, and could you answer that?
I think just because the steering committee is kind of focusing on all sorts of zoning standards for really other kinds of development, you know, every other week.
I can add to that.
Yeah.
You did a good job answering, and just from the township's perspective, there is kind of that interface between land and water. There's been a lot of development pressure there. It's been a big topic of conversation, and so that was an area we wanted to do a deeper dive. But we would absolutely welcome your feedback on anything natural resource related tonight, as well as at any future subcommittee meetings.
And just to add to that too, the landscaping standards and kind of not just landscaping in terms of like new landscaping, but, you know, preservation standards, you know, those type of standards should be reviewed and discussed at, I believe, the next upcoming steering committee meeting. So you might want to tune in this coming Wednesday morning. Is that the 1st, March 1st? Yep. Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Well, now for the fun part. Thank you, Andy. Okay. Okay, so at each one of your tables, there is a facilitator. So can I get my facilitators to raise their hands? Okay, great, thank you. So I would encourage you to sit with people that you don't know. I know that you're already sitting, but I would encourage you to join a table if you're not already joining a table. We have a few seats open here, up as well as up here in the front. And I think it's a great opportunity to talk with people that you haven't met before and who don't necessarily share the same experience or perspectives as you. So we are going to regroup. What time is it right now? Is it 7:15? We're going to regroup at 7:40. So this is a 35-minute activity. Just wanted, we've got 5 minutes for introductions. We want to hear for 10 minutes, you will discuss what's working well in the township related to riparian zoning. For 10 minutes, you'll talk about opportunities in the township related to the riparian zoning. And for 10 minutes, you'll talk about possible solutions and who could take the lead on those solutions. So your facilitators are well-versed in this exercise, and they will be there to guide you through. So before we jump into this, I just wanted to highlight a few ground rules. They probably don't even need to be said, but just some reminders. We want to make sure that you listen and respect other points of view. So we want to hear from everyone, and even those who might not share the same views as you. There's no wrong answers. Everyone's encouraged to participate, and so we want to make sure no one's dominating the conversation. Make sure only one person's speaking at a time, and so just please refrain from side conversations when we're going through this. Do your best to understand the pros and cons of every option. If there's, and then the fifth one, seek first to understand, not to be understood. So if you have questions, please follow up. You're going to have, in addition to your facilitator, you'll have one person that's transcribing with a black marker on the big paper. So select one person that has decent handwriting and is willing to transcribe. We're going to take all of the input from this evening tonight and transcribe it and send out notes. So everything that gets discussed is going to get recorded and documented. And then the last role for your group is to have somebody that's going to report back, because at the end of, at 7:50 when we reconvene, we want to hear the top two things that are working well, top two things that could use improvement, and then all of your recommended solutions. So any questions before we break? Okay. you're just gonna verbally, and I'm gonna write down your solutions.
I'm gonna write it again.
I'm just gonna write down your solutions, but you can go through. So Mindy's gonna go through, hey, can I get your attention? Hello, can you hear me?
Can you hear me? I don't think this is working.
Okay, so, do you want me to do this? So Mindy's going to go through her top two things that are working well, the top two things, top two challenges, and then all the solutions. And I'm going to write down all the solutions of all the groups, and then we're going to vote on them. We're going to do a prioritization activity at the end. Okay.
So I'm from Table 6, and what we found to be working was the presence of the overlay districts. The fact that they exist and have regulations for the different areas. And what we also liked, what was working, were meetings such as this, that has public participation, let everybody know what's going on, and some people get a little bit more education on what's going on and how things are happening. We found improvement opportunities in the lack of the wetland ordinances, specifically properties less than 5 acres, and then again for the properties larger than 5 acres, more restrictive restrictions for the wetlands. The second thing that we found is an improvement opportunity is the lack of education and associated enforcement of that, right? So if we could improve everybody's knowledge of what's going on, then we can, more easily enforce because everybody knows what's going on and they can talk to each other and let each other know what the requirements are. So our solutions. Coordination of permits between the federal government, the state, the county, and the local unit. And we would like some wetland ordinances. Less than 5 acres, and one that's greater than 5 acres that's more restricted than what the state already has.
We can have more, she said all of our solutions, right?
Two we wrote down.
All of the cultivate the culture of education is our natural resources.
Great, thank you.
Good evening. I'd like to thank Renee Edley for leading us in this vibrant discussion this evening. Things that were working well that our group came up, that's table number 2, was that the flow, the Forest Lakes overlay, Mitchell Creek and Baker Creek overlays, and then the more engagement is working well. We really like this community engagement, and everyone felt very positive about that one. And then improvements, of course, enforcement, just as the survey indicated as well. And then need for enhancing section 231, 406, 407, 201, and 505. We're being brief here, so I didn't want to go into the book. Solutions. Again, enhance those ordinances that were brought up.
Can you repeat those numbers?
Really? Okay, 231, 406, 407, 201, and 505. Follow up to permits. When we issue a permit, it would be good to, if we could have someone go to the site and make sure they're actually doing what was indicated on the permit. Another solution would be to strengthen the Forest Lakes watershed and create a watershed protection plan. And then also to create groundwater standards. And then better, we'll echo number 1, coordination with agencies. And then more leadership regarding invasive species control. Thank you.
We should probably keep all those.
Yeah, I can take them.
Could we get some tape, maybe? What was the last one? More leadership?
More invasive species leadership, or leadership regarding invasive species. Oh, okay.
Okay, who's our next group?
We were table number 1, led by Dan Leonard, and we had representation from Arbutus, Rennie, as well as Spider Lake, as well as Dustin from Flaska Landscaping, and we had some productive discussions, things that are working well. We agreed were the possibility to discuss these issues with this forum, as well as with subcommittee meetings, involvement that's been asked by the township of riparians, as well as other representatives, the ability to meet individually and have a discussion rather than just give public comment, and that's very important. And actually, the Forest Lake overlay is very robust, and that's a strength as well. Needing improvement, everybody was focused a lot on concerns about enforcement. Granting variance waivers were too lenient in general, setbacks as well as other features. A little bit of discussion regarding that was the inexactness of the current data that's available around the lakes and around the properties around the lakes, and how best to maybe get a handle on that. And we'll come to some of the recommendations later on regarding to that. There was strong discussion regarding septic system inspection, and either at times of sale or periodically to ensure the integrity of the groundwater as well as the ecosystem and the quality of the lakes. Solutions, some flexibility to allow the variances, so to be able to trade off potential benefits in one area for leniency in granting variances, such as giving increased protection and reestablishment of the nearshore buffer zone as a trade-off on the project to allow the whole parcel to become more beneficial for the ecosystem. So a trade-off to restore buffer and improve the overall project and lot for the ecosystem. Next solution, photo documentation of the shoreline property by whatever measure. Survey of the lake by riparians or the township versus drones, so that you have an idea what the shoreline's looking like or what it should look like before and after projects, specifically before allowing any permits to be issued. We wanted to strongly suggest that there should be required septic inspections at the sale of the property, as well as periodically for obvious reasons. And there was a discussion about incentivizing proposals at the township level in some ways, so that the township can assist property owners in making changes to their property which would be beneficial. And specifically, if there's major septic problems, some kind of capital improvement plan or a tax vehicle or a credit or a low-interest loan or something that would allow the property owner not to view these things as a burden, that they would be more willing to undergo inspections without the fear of not being able to afford them for the lakefront integrity. also for natural shorelines development. So for the township to possibly incentivize, as Heather mentioned, bioengineered or natural shoreline development rather than hardening. And there was a discussion, a suggestion that the township could provide active workshops with specialists for riparians so that they will have some idea what are the options for permeable surfaces and for natural shoreline resources, since those things aren't always evident as we're making our changes to our properties. Thank you.
We were at table number 3, and what's working well is Forest Lakes Overlay District, so that's another one. And also involved riparian residents and property owners in that social media has really helped, getting people involved. So some of the opportunities for improvement, enforcement. Enforce existing rules. It's make it easier to ask permission and harder to ask forgiveness. And so enforcement is a big one. And maybe incentivize, that also came up as well. What needs improvement is wake boat and I guess laws, so that we look at what it's doing not only to our shorelines but also to our lake bottoms and the ecology of the lakes. And so we have more than just 2 as far as
Let's hear all your solutions.
okay, and solution. Better enforcement of short-term rentals, vacation rental by owners, lack of stewardship by those folks, so maybe more information there, better handling there. Solution, improve the tree ordinance inventory for residential new builds or remodels, as what was mentioned before in the presentation. And then one other one was, I'll wait till you're done. Thank you. And then Greg had mentioned about the workshops that the township could put on and bring in specialists, but somebody that can help define the ordinary high water mark for residents.
I'm coming from table 5 here. I think pretty much everything that we discussed has been hit on here at some point in time. A couple of the things that we thought were working well, we felt like the overlay was a well-intentioned document and a well-intentioned plan, and that it was pretty robust the way that it is. We felt like this community engagement and the activity that we're having here is really effective, and we really appreciated that. As far as opportunities go, just more education, whether it be contractors, we mentioned realtors. One of the things that I mentioned was from the landscaping industry. A lot of times we are the people who are educating homeowners, and it seems like we're the last people that they talk to, and somebody, before they get to us, should have told them what they are not allowed to do. We thought a couple of the practical ways to get those out might be through new resident notices. And then just kind of a general note as far as improvements, I think it was already mentioned, but short-term rentals, I think that's a pretty broad conversation that maybe goes just beyond riparian rights, but we brought that up. Solutions, I think we discussed the cost sharing as far as like native plantings go, or erosion control solutions, or shoreline restoration. I think that's already been brought up as well. That's pretty much about as far as we got with the solutions.
Well, I drew the short stick.
What we decided was working well was that there were more awareness of and enforcement of the ordinances. So that, you know, we're getting to the point where enough people are beginning to be aware of them because they're too easy to ignore because, well, just because they are. And one of the things that we learned, thanks to our resident, I can't remember your name.
Adam.
Adam.
From AMO.
Adam from AMO. How many environmentally sound solutions there are to some issues like permeable landscaping and things like that. So that kind of thing, even some years back, was not available to us. What needs improvement? Septic system ordinance. I mean, I think we're pretty much agreed on that, even though my septic. But anyway. And more clarity and more information to people about those ordinances and what is required of people. And some of the solutions were, one thing, educational efforts like this one. And information out there, and maybe even like little bullet points in the township bulletin that comes out, like 4 or 5 things every time, instead of mailing somebody a big packet and saying, would you kindly read 14 pages about the ordinances, and, you know, because nobody's got time for that. Improve the website so that it's easier to use was also one. And one solution that we talked about was, when you make these improvements on your property, is it possible to get a little tax break? Don't you think that sounds like a good idea? There we are. Thank you.
Okay, can we? Thank you. Okay, so we've got all 6 groups came up and provided their solutions. So we've got 3 pages right here, and I'm just going to go ahead and review the solutions, and then I want each person here is going to come up and vote on their top 3 solutions.
Claire, I have a question. People had solutions that are on the table that they didn't get aired.
Add them on.
Add them to that or to?
Tell me now.
Oh, well, I mean, Claire, it's too long. It's like long lists that people wanted to add on, I think, you know, and so is there a
Email.
Is there a vehicle to get them?
Email me and we'll include them in the notes as a part of the meeting. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read. No, we'll do, so these are all the solutions, so.
She wrote them down.
I wrote down, I think these ones were from your group. Okay, so our solutions are coordination of permits between federal, state, and local. We've got wetland ordinance, more restrictive than the state. Education and just cultivating a culture of education. Enhancing sections 231, 406, 407, 201, and 505. Follow up on land use permits with a site visit. Forest Lakes Watershed Protection Plan. Groundwater standards. Leadership on invasive species. Flexibility, providing, and I think this was Greg, and I hope I captured it correctly, but providing some trade-offs, giving a little bit in exchange for some benefits when you're reviewing variances to ensure that it's meeting the intent of the ordinance related to the buffer. Photo documentation of property before issuing permit, septic inspection requirements, looking at financing or incentives for inspections or addressing septic issues, bioengineering, having some sort of financing or incentives for that. educational workshops on the natural shoreline, short-term rental enforcement, and improving stewardship on those properties, tree ordinance for residential development and remodeling, defining the ordinary high water mark, which we are in the process of. We did hire a firm, and so we are in the process of having a benchmark for each of the inland lakes, and that should be done shortly. But you can still vote for it. New resident notices, native plantings, township newsletter, providing bullets as opposed to the huge packet of information that we currently send, but there's a lot of information to share. Township improve website and the usability of it, and then tax break for improvements. So, yes, Steve?
Where did enforcement to, as a solution, increased enforcement, what one was that one?
Let's see. Enforcement's not a...
Follow up on land use permits, site visit, was that one?
So just enforcement. Yeah, everybody said enforcement, yeah.
I think that was the challenge that got mentioned quite a few times, but...
That was under our opportunities to make it easier to have
Yeah.
information and make it more.
Yeah, I don't know if it got into the solutions, but thank you. We'll put that in there on the solution.
Claire, this 231 is Forest Lakes Overlay District, Boardman River District, natural areas, 201 is nonconformance, and 505 is setbacks.
Thank you. Okay, so everyone here, don't all come at once, but you can make your way up to the front. And there's sticky dots on your table, so take 3 sticky dots and vote for your top 3. If there's one that you are 100% behind and you don't really believe in any other ones, you can put 3 on one. But don't vote more than 3 times, please.
Do it by table.
Okay, we'll let this table come up first. We'll do it by tables. Good idea. You can stay. Okay, so this table can come up first, right here.
I couldn't get that to work, or at least it didn't sound like it was.
Okay, so thanks, Preston. So it looks like our top voting one was enforcement with 18 votes. We've got septic inspection requirements, or taking a look at a septic ordinance, that's got 15 votes. Enhancing the sections as noted, 231, 406, 407, 201, 505.
There'll be a test on that.
That was 11 votes. Everyone who voted can needs to know the section, the titles. So those were the top 3. Also getting quite a few votes, coordination of permits between federal, state, local, taking a look at a wetland ordinance, a culture of education, a Forest Lakes Watershed Protection Plan, taking a look at the flexibility that was noted, cost-benefit analysis, short-term rental enforcement, financing options, as well as tax break for improvements. So, well, thank you again, everyone, for coming this evening. Just to wrap up, I had a few notes. One, I just wanted to mention in the back, there's the Parks and Recreation poster board. We have a survey that's currently open. We're updating the Parks and Recreation Master Plan, so please go online and take the survey. We're looking for input on future Parks and Recreation improvements. Wanted to just mention the Zoning Ordinance Subcommittee meets every other Wednesday morning at 8:30 a.m. These meetings are open to the public. We post the agendas and packets online, so you're welcome to attend those meetings. I will mention that all of the information and recommendations that are coming before the Zoning Ordinance Subcommittee will also be reviewed by the Planning Commission. So the Planning Commission meets the first Tuesday of the month with special meetings the third Tuesday, so I'd encourage you to stay engaged and attend Planning Commission meetings. Those meetings are at 6:30 in the evening. Also would encourage you to sign up for email notifications on the township website. It's Documents on Demand. So if you go to eastbaytownship.org, under Agenda and Minutes, you can sign up for email notifications, and then you can be notified for when we've got new agenda items posted, and you can see what the Planning Commission is reviewing. So in terms of this process, it will go from the Zoning Ordinance Subcommittee, will make a recommendation to the Planning Commission. Planning Commission will review language, make a recommendation to the Township Board, and Township Board ultimately will adopt any changes to the zoning ordinance. So there's lots of feedback loops and lots of opportunity for engagement. And with that, we got a couple questions. So, Steve.
I just want to reiterate the importance of that 5-year Parks and Recreation plan, because that has to be sent then to the state for approval, which makes us eligible for state grants, Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund grants. So going on there, making sure projects that you feel are important in these parks are included on there.
Which we have
Thank you.
$1 million in grant revenues from that process, so.
Great, yep, thank you. Yeah, Ralph.
I may have missed it, and I apologize if I have, but what's the intent of this? What are your next steps with this? And how are you going to inform us?
Yeah, so great question, and we are going to take all of the input that was received tonight. If you signed up in the back and provided your email, we're going to follow up with an email that summarizes all of the input that we received tonight. We'll also follow up with information from a copy of the PowerPoint slides, as well as all of the handouts. All of the input that comes out of this public workshop is going to feed into the subcommittee. So that's going to go directly into the subcommittee that's reviewing the ordinance improvements. Yes, Greg?
Input for people who have not had the opportunity to attend this meeting. There were links available that they could watch this stream, as well as input options that they can email you. Will those inputs be included?
Everything, yes, everything will be included. Thank you for making that point. Carol?
Simple. When is that next meeting? It's every other Wednesday, is that?
So it's not this Wednesday, but it's the following Wednesday. It's the 1st, March 1st, yep.
Okay, everybody mark the calendar.
Okay. Well, with that, we'll wrap it up. But thank you all for coming out tonight, and we finished right on time. So enjoy your evening.